It is 7 o'clock, so we will go ahead and get started. And just want to make a couple of introductions. So my name is Miranda McGuire, and I work for Purdue Horse Extension. And I'm so excited that we could have this webinar series. This is the first one of 3. And tonight we're going to talk about getting your pastures ready for spring. So we have Dr. Colleen Brady with us tonight as well. She is your horse extension specialist in Indiana. She works at Purdue University. And then we also have a very special guest, Dr. Keith Johnson. So I will let him introduce himself and we will go ahead and get started.
Well, thank you very much for this opportunity to share a winter's evening with you as we think about green pastures. Kind of hard to believe that mid-April will be here soon, and really the green up time starts really in southern Indiana sometime in about the third week of March, and we're not that far away. I'm going to, Miranda, if you don't mind, I'm going to share my screen.
You should have that. Yep. Okay, good.
Good.
I made you a host, so.
Thank you. Okay, are we full screen too?
I think you need to go into presentation mode.
I see it now. There we go. I thought that looked a little bit unfull. Well, again, thank you very much. And this is an exciting opportunity for me. And when Miranda, a former student of mine in my forages class, asked me to do this, I responded yes with no hesitation. So Webinar Wednesdays, I like the title, and we're going to talk about preparing pastures for spring. A little bit about my past and present. I grew up in the state of Nebraska and feel very fortunate to really grow up in the environment that I did. Thankfully, I liked being on the farm and working some awfully long hours in the middle of the summer, but it was good. The farm background that I had as a youth was irrigated corn and grain sorghum, dryland wheat and oats. We raised swine, we had beef. The dominant forages were alfalfa and smooth brome grass. And yes, I was around 2 horses as a youth for a little bit of time. And if you don't mind, I'll just digress a little bit about some of my experiences. I was 7 years old, and I remember that potential year of my birthday as one very special. It was the year of transportation. I got a beautiful red 24-inch Schwinn bike, and I got a pony. And I named him Silver. You'll never guess what color he was. Well, Silver was a little spunky thing. Needed a little bit of help of my father to kind of get him to used to the bridle and all of that. But what I did as a youth when I got off the school bus is I'd go change my clothes, and this would be in the fall time of year. And my mother and I would go out to Silver, and she would help me at that time. I was only probably 7 or 8 years old. And my job was to go out with Silver to the residues from the cornfield. In other words, the grain had been harvested, and the cattle were out there, and we didn't want them to gorge themselves on too much grain early in the process of doing that. So my job was to go out and round them up and bring them back for the night so they wouldn't overeat corn grain that had been left in the field that didn't make it in the combine. Well, my mother, bless her heart, never got to the point that she could get Silver to suck it in, if you know what I mean. And she'd cinch him up, and then he would find a situation then that as I got on the horse and would travel probably no more than 100 yards, the saddle would start to slip. The saddle would go under its belly. I'd fall off, and I'd end up walking the cattle back more often than not. The other thing I recall about him, and if you look carefully, you'll see that I've got quite a pug nose, is I was in the dry lot, and he was there, and I hopped on him with no bridle. Didn't try to bridle him, and I thought, boy, this is strange. He's never allowed me to do this. And it was a situation, if you can think about a doorway, the lower half was open and the upper half was closed, and he decided he was going to go into the barn. And Chubby Keith didn't have time to get off of that horse. And as a result, my face hit the top door, went back on the ground, and somehow survived that. But so those are kind of some experiences that I had as a kid, but they are a beautiful animal. The other animal is one that was part draft horse. And for whatever reason, I had the weirdest dreams that I'd be laying in the bunk and she'd be sticking her head in as though she were to eat me. So a little bit of reflection on horses in my life. I really look back fondly of being a 4-H and FFA member. Really great experiences for me. And I know for many of you that are in those organizations, I hope you are having similar excellent opportunities to learn about whatever it is in 4-H and FFA. I decided I'd go to the University of Nebraska and receive my bachelor's degree. And I started out in agronomy. Agronomy is the study of crops and soils and the environment about it to grow those crops. And I really enjoyed that. But I also said to myself in my freshman year, you know, if there's an opportunity to go back to the farm, I will have livestock. And so I dual majored in animal science. And as it turned out, that was very fortuitous that happened. I came to Purdue University in 1976 to start my master's degree, which was then followed by a PhD. And I had a forage emphasis. And again, just kind of looking back, my interest in agronomy and animal science at the University of Nebraska. I did teach a course there as a senior to students that was forage related. And I think that was kind of the birth of where that interest started. So after my PhD, I started on the faculty at Purdue University in 1981 and have continued to do that until the present day. And I am the Purdue Forage Extension Specialist. And, you know, you got to enunciate 4-H. Sometimes if I don't do that, they think I am in 4-H. But forages are really those plants that we use to feed livestock, used as soil conservation type plants. They're grasses, they're legumes, they're forbs, and we'll look at a few of those tonight. My research has been related to livestock feed, and more recently, I've looked at one grass, switchgrass, as potential for biofuel. In other words, fuel that would be used by us to, you know, replace some of the fossil fuels that may be powering what we do. The classes I teach is a forage management class. This is the class that Miranda was in, and also a professional improvement class that deals with communicating science with the public. So enough about me, but those are my backgrounds, and I've had a lot of experiences from 1981 to the present. So pastures really do matter. They are a feed resource, they protect the soil, and they improve water quality. And also they improve the whole soil health aspect as we think about this beautiful, beautiful green covering the landscape. Now, what I would like to do tonight is, and I've been given the charge to think about considerations as spring approaches. And so we have some crocus that are, you know, cracking there. The cold probably sometime in the month of late March or early April. But I'm going to focus tonight with the time that I have on stocking rate, mud, soil fertility, inventorying the plants, and thinking about improved grazing systems. So here we go. Do we have a pasture, or do we have a sacrifice lot? And this is a picture that I took in mid-April, and you can see the beautiful horses out there on the green landscape. In my opinion, that is grazed too close. The horses were turned out too early for the well-being of that grass. And then if we look at a situation here in a dry August, you can see the ovals that I have. Here we see the feces, the manure of the horse. That really should not be visible, frankly, if we're properly grazing. We should be leaving, as we move from pasture to pasture, paddock to paddock, around 4 inches of forage. And here, as you can see, we're probably down to something less than an inch. The other oval that you see in the lower center, I think, is some sort of beverage can that got smashed. And certainly you could see that, and I could see it from the roadside. So just examples here of situations that I consider to be too overgrazed for the well-being of the pasture and ultimately for the horse. Miranda, I'm going to step back. One thing I forgot to do, we were going to do a chat question, right? Do you want to share what that is?
Yes. You got to remember what you said.
Well, essentially what I was going to ask you, and I want you to go to the chat box, and we'll just take 30 seconds to do this. But what is one thing, not lots of things, but what is the major thing that you want to take away from the hour that you're spending here with me tonight? What is something you want to take away? I want to know what you want to know and see if I'm hitting any of the targets. And if not, we'll talk about those at question time. But why did you turn in the computer on today to learn about spring pasture? So if you could go to a chat and just type in some phrases, don't need to be complete sentences.
Do you see the chat box, Dr. Johnson?
I sure do. I see.
Okay.
One person's done it. There we go. Now we're starting to grow.
Yep.
So you young people, if you're there with grandpa or grandma, you may have to show them where the chat is. And what we'll do, we'll review these after the program tonight, just to get an idea of what you as people in part of this education really want to see, and maybe we need to adjust future programs or develop future programs.
They're really good. There's also another intro question that you had that we can ask next.
Okay, you want to share that with me? Can you see it? Okay,
yep.
I'd prefer that you do that and moderate for me.
Sure. So you can still answer the first question, what you want to learn tonight. The next question that we have for y'all is, what is the greatest obstacle you have with managing your pastures?
Yep, that's the next one. What's the greatest obstacle? What do you struggle with the most? So that's the second question. So if you've done the first one, type in again, what's the obstacle? Again, we appreciate you doing this because we will review this information.
These are really good. Yeah.
Keep it growing. This will all be anonymous. Looks like we stalled out, Miranda.
Yep. So
okay.
You can.
Let's move on. And if you want to think about that a little bit more, don't be afraid to write in the chat what that obstacle might be. Okay.
Also, if you have any questions anytime, feel free to put them in the chat, and we'll answer as we go or when time is appropriate. But just so you don't lose your train of thought, just throw it in the chat.
That'll be fine. I don't mind to have those. I don't consider them interruptions. It's part of the educational process. So feel free to do that, and Miranda will moderate, and she'll tell me to slow down, and we'll talk about it. So I do not want your pastures to look like a putting green, okay? I do not want it to look like a putting green where we could take a golf club and a ball and dig a hole and sink a hole in one. So what is affect stocking rate? You know, how many horses can you have per acre? And you know, this is going to vary a lot. If we're in dry southwestern United States, it's certainly going to vary as compared to where we are in Indiana tonight, where we typically will get, you know, 45 inches of rain. And that is certainly a driver. And also then, you know, where we are in terms of whether we have length of growing season that's long, like the southeastern United States, or whether it's going to be shorter, like the north central Great Plains of North Dakota and Montana and so forth. But I will tell you that I have learned that probably about the right stocking rate to start with is 2 acres per horse, okay? And I'm not talking about a horse that's a little Shetland pony, okay? And that's going to vary depending on size, right? And I'm not talking about the huge draft horses. I'm probably talking about the type of horses that most of you have that might weigh, what, Miranda, around 1,200 pounds or so? Is that pretty accurate? Anyway, it's that type of horse where I'm looking at 2 acres per horse, thinking about being a starting point. And if you've got better soil, you might be less than that. On the other hand, if you have soil that's got some restrictions that may take more acres. And I'm looking at this as being a major feed resource, okay? I expect them to be able to reduce the hay that they are fed because they are grazing a good majority of the day when the forage is growing. Now, some of you, unfortunately, may have seen your neighbors, okay, with situations like on the left, the horses are at a bale of hay and a lot of it's being wasted and being trampled in the mud. And, you know, cheap concrete that we had just recently is really kind of nice because we avoid this situation where the horses are up to their knees and flanks in that mud situation that is very, very hard on them, frankly. And I want to suggest to you that in beef cattle enterprises in particular, a lot of people are putting the high use area pad like you see on the right-hand side. And what you see there, the black that you see on the far right is geotextile cloth, okay? And that's covered with about 6 inches of coarse limestone. And then the top, which you see on the left-hand side of that being built, is very fine limestone. And the purpose of the geotextile cloth is to prevent the stone from getting mired into the soil when we have situations like you see the horses on the left. So I would put a ring feeder there. You can put this around gateways. You can put this around water areas. And it is just going to help situations a whole lot in terms of keeping your horses with less mud on them and just a whole lot better environment to have. So consider the opportunity of doing that. A good resource for you to have conversation with is the Natural Resources Soil Conservation Service that will be in each of your counties. And they are technical people that can help you out with the real specifications of how to build something like this. So first, I'm going to move into here about soil testing. And, you know, if the tractor is not fueled, okay, in other words, it's not fed, it dies. And there it sits back in the far zone somewhere, never to run again. If the horse is not fed for an extended period, it dies. And unfortunately, this next picture is one that we really need to help this animal that's got a body condition score that's extremely low. And if that horse was not fed, it would in time meet its maker. And we don't want that to happen, do we? But likewise, if you think about forages, you think about grasses and legumes and forbs in the pasture, if they're not fed with fertility, with fertilizer in the right amounts, and we fail to do that over an extended period of time, it too is going to not meet objectives, and it could possibly die as well. So it's critical to feed the pasture and the hay fields. So this is a technology that really came about, I would say, about close to 15 years ago, and really great use of computer technology. This is the Web Soil Survey. This is computer technology that helps us make decisions. And we can sample our soils by soil type for nutrient analysis. We can look at soil variables of things like drainage or texture or slope or restrictions that are in the soil. Maybe it's got a hard layer that we call a fragipan, or maybe 6 inches below the top soil, there's big rocks, those sorts of restrictions. We can look at crop productivity rating of forages such as hay yield or pasture production. We can look at corn and soybean, and we can look at suitability for trees as an example. Are the soils that you have on your farm, are they suitable for building corrals or homes or those sorts of things? And then, of course, when you're out and about, we need to think about a septic system. And some soils are not great for the application of installing a septic. So the next slide that I'm going to show you is from the soil survey from the web. And here you can see that we have two major soil types. We have one here, okay, and we have one down here, and there's an itty bitty amount right here in this area of interest, which is outlined by this light blue line, okay? And so this is going to help us in terms of soil sampling. I think this is a great place to start, as I would sample this soil type, okay, here, that extends over to here and over here. I would keep this one here, okay, and be its own soil, because there's going to be certain situations about it from a fertility wise, from the way it was formed, that could be, a little bit different or quite a bit different from the rest of the soil, okay? And what's also nice about the Web Soil Survey is it will give us the map unit legends. So we know that one particular soil that had the most was a Camden silt loam, had till substratum, it had 2 to 6% slopes, it had some erosion concerns in the past, and there was around 13 acres in the AOI, which is the area of interest, and it gives a percentile. And so again, we had 3 types, and you can take a look here. That one that was next to the woods, don't think this would be very apropos for a very good pasture, 35 to 80% slopes, has boulders in it and so forth. So lots of things that we can learn about soil. So I encourage you to browse Web Soil Survey. You're not going to break it. Find your fields of interest and learn about the soils. And you're also going to find, as you look at this, that some forages need well-drained soils. So it's kind of silly to be planting as an example. Let's go the other way. If we have poorly drained samples and you have a forage that needs well drainage, it's kind of silly to be putting that forage that needs well drainage on a soil that's poorly or somewhat poorly drained. So let's talk about doing the physical work in terms of soil sampling, so we can send the sample off to the laboratory to be analyzed for nutrients that are in it and the soil pH, which all of that's going to affect the productivity of that pasture. So I think a good starting point is to do it by soil type. And again, you're going to see that on that soil map. It in part's got to be based on the previous crop that you have. So you may have the same soil type, but maybe on half of it, it had been in pasture, and the other half, maybe it had been in a hay field with different forages in it, and of course managed differently. And then you want to sample the typical versus the issue areas. So as an example, issue areas that I consider are the roadsides. And many of you might have seen in a dry summer as you go along the dust that rolls off of the road. Well, that's typically limestone, which increases soil pH, and ultimately it drifts in the field and it has fallout. And so where it falls out, it's going to be a higher pH than the area that it does not. Feeding area, okay, as an example, around where those horses that I showed have been fed, the nutrients are going to be extremely high there. And of course, if we think about a shade tree, what's the first thing that horses and other livestock do when they decide to get up and graze and maybe take a run in the pasture? Well, they get up and they stretch, right? They wake up a bit, and then they decide to pee or poop, right? And so those areas where that sort of accumulation happens to a great degree is going to have a lot higher nutrient load. The other thing I've seen is old properties and even new properties, but you can go back generations where a barn was, and great-great-grandfather or great-grandfather, they didn't have the means to get to the far reaches of the field very easily, particularly in the winter. So they typically hauled that manure out of the barn as close as they could. And so those types of areas, present and past, you can easily see that they typically will have a pretty high phosphorus level, which is a major component that we find in manure. So if we have an established pasture, in other words, already there, the right depth to consider sampling is 4 inches. If you're going to do a new seeding, in other words, transition from, let's say, a corn or a soybean or a wheat field, and we do some tillage, okay, sample to the tillage depth. And we want to use proper equipment. Now, you'll see that Mr. Shelton here, okay, and he's a pretty big man, and it was a dry day, and he's working hard. He's doing the physical work, but he's getting down there. I think in this particular study that we did, we were trying to get down 8 inches. And I'm glad we had a good soil probe. So he's got a soil probe that's really made well. Don't buy a cheap one. Really get a good one. And you'll also see that we're over here watching, okay? We're watching, but we're actually taking the probes, the soil samples, and putting them in these plastic buckets. And I emphasize that because we do not want to use a bucket with galvanization because, of course, there's minerals and sometimes they flake. And as a result, you can get some faulty readings of what the soil is if you use an unclean bucket or one that's galvanized where you've got some flaking occur. So a good, clean plastic bucket is what you want to use to put those probes in. And we want approximately 15 probes per sample that will be sent then. We're going to air dry them, and we'll send them off to a laboratory. And we have lots of laboratories that do a good job of measuring the nutrients in the soil. So I would encourage you not to use the trowel that you see here in the bottom. Certainly could be used, but really prefer that we get one of these soil probes. And they can be found relatively easy. Browse soil probes, and there's companies that manufacture and sell these at a reasonable price. And it should last you, if you take care of it, a very, very long time. So here I am, old bald Keith, when I was thinner. I got all this results back. You can see the lab number up here, and we've got all the different variables that we're looking at. And I've got lots of soils that I took in my pasture and my hay field. Now, what do we do? Okay, and this is probably where some of us might throw up our hands and really wonder, now what? Well, this is what I'm going to suggest. You need to work with trained soil fertility people that have a passion for fertility, that work with fertilizers, but I think importantly too, that work with forages. I think you'll find that people that are strictly working with corn and soybean have less training in forages. So I would try to find somebody that is willing to be trained or has the training in forage fertility to give you the best recommendations. One of my pet peeves, you all know what a pet peeve is, something that kind of bothers you. And this is one of my pet peeves. And if one of these individual recommends to you that a similar triple number fertilizer be applied, and that would be an example of 12, 12, 12. Some of you probably know that the first 12 is nitrogen, the second 12 is P2O5, phosphate, and the last 12 is K2O, potash. So those are nutrients that we apply in some level in the field. It may be a lot, it may be very little, based on the nutrition of that soil, the nutrients in the soil that we get back on this test. And so to me, if you get that recommendation, let's say if 300 pounds of 12, 12, 12, that's what you need to apply. To me, that's very much a red flag, because we want to base the amount of nutrients we have not on some general passed down rule of thumb that makes me feel good because as a horse owner, I've done something to my pastures. But we want to make sure that we've got the right amount of nutrients being applied to that field. So as an example, 300 pounds, and these are percents, I'd be applying 12% of 300 is 36 pounds of nitrogen, 36 pounds of P2O5, 36 pounds of K2O. And it's very unlikely, probably more apt to win the lottery instead of that 300 pounds of 12, 12, 12 being the right situation for a pasture. I'm going to pause. Any questions?
There was one, just
Okay.
a clarification of, was it geotextile that was under the limestone for
Correct.
the muddy? Okay.
Correct. Yep. Or somebody might call it landscaping cloth. Yeah, heavy duty landscaping cloth, which is again called geotextile. That's right. Yep. Any others? Okay, well, you write your questions down. We get to the end, we'll take some time and answer them for you, or we'll try. Okay. The next category I want to talk about is going out to your pasture when they begin to grow and inventory what's out there. Now, what's out there? Well, probably forage grasses, forage legumes, forage forbs, some weeds probably are there. And I have learned that some weeds are weedier than others. Some weeds actually can provide some nutrition that are not harmful to your horse. However, there are some weeds that, eaten too much, the animal could meet its maker, have poisonous properties. So forage grasses that we typically think about, at least in this Midwest region, are going to be cool season grasses. Although there are warm season grasses, of course, cool season grasses grow when it's cool. That means spring and going into the late summer and fall. Warm season grasses grow when it gets to be warm in June, July, and August and early September. Forage legumes, legumes would be things like alfalfa and the clovers, bird's foot trefoil. They're special because they're higher in nutrition typically than the grasses, and they have the process of nitrogen fixation where some of that nitrogen, as the roots decompose, can feed the grasses. So we don't need to be applying nitrogen to a grass legume type of pasture because the legumes are helping feed the grass nitrogen. Forage forbs, some examples of those, don't know how much of these are used in your industry, but examples of that would be chicory, kale, turnips. Those would be examples that the animals would graze the herbage, the green growth, and then of course with the turnip situation that I talked about, could get some value from that bulb in the soil. So let's talk about forage identification. This is a real skill that one can learn or utilize resource people or other resources that are available to know what's out in your pasture. And so the Forage Field Guide is, in my opinion, a good reference. It's about 280 pages in length. It's a pocket guide. It sells for $9 and at the education store. And the number is ID 317. And it's more than forage identification. It's got insects, it's got weeds, It's got the forages. It tells about pasture recommendations, and it also talks about hay harvest and utilization by livestock. The other thing is look for other books. Internet sources certainly are available. I like plants.usda.gov, especially when I get the plant identified. It's a front back type of page, pretty, very, very detailed in the right way, public friendly verbiage, but you can learn a lot about the plant in terms of its, its quality, its yield, whether there's toxic properties associated with it or not. And then lastly, there are apps that are available. And the one that I have on my phone is the iNaturalist. There are several, but you take a picture and somehow, some way in 4 or 5 seconds, it will try to give you a short list. Sometimes it's right on in terms of what it is, but I'll tell you what, the app giving you 5 plants to consider is a whole lot better than probably the over 500,000 or more that are out there in the world to start with. So I encourage you to download that and give it a try. The iNaturalist will also identify insects, tree leaves, bushes in the landscape, as well as forages. And for heck with it, at one time, I took a picture of a cat that knew what a cat was. So can't go wrong with the iNaturalist, can you? Okay. Let's see, it doesn't want to go. Stalled out, Miranda.
So the PowerPoint doesn't want to advance?
Yeah, it doesn't want to go. See what I did. Don't think I did anything.
No, it doesn't look like.
Should I stop share and try a new share?
Probably.
Yep.
Let's try that.
It found out some modified reason of stop and start all over, yeah.
Well, we at least got there, didn't we? Whoops. There we go. Let's go backwards. Excellent. Whatever I did, we're good. Okay. So I'm going to give you some examples of possible concern, and maybe some of you saw the answer. Darn it if you did. But anybody know what that plant is? Somebody want to chat it? It's a grass. It's a cool season grass. Once upon a time, before the 1990s, I would not have talked about this grass with your industry. They would have shunned me. Anybody know?
We got some guesses. We got
What do we got? Any tall fescues?
crown grass fescue.
Okay.
Dr.
Okay.
Brady gave a hint.
Okay. It's endophyte infected tall fescue. Okay. This is a grass of possible concern. Now, what happened that I can talk about fescue with all of you and feel pretty good about it is plant breeding came about and was able to, first of all, pretty much remove the endophyte. What does endophyte mean? Endophyte means within plant, and it's a fungus. It's an endophytic fungus, within plant fungus. It's not like a fungus that you can see. You have to go to microscope to see the fungus, but it produces alkaloids. And these are the varieties of the past. Plant breeders have developed varieties of tall fescue that have very, very, very little endophytes, thus very, very, very low alkaloids. And the other thing that's kind of cool is the fact that they developed a fescue that they called a novel fescue that has an endophyte, but it doesn't produce bad things for the livestock that consume it, but it gives strength to the plant. And that's what the endophyte actually, it does, is it improves drought tolerance. It keeps insects away. There's less disease. So when we recommend tall fescue today, to livestock people and horse owners. Most of the time, we're going to talk about a novel endophyte that, again, gives strength to the grass, but does not have the alkaloid poison within it of varieties of old. So if we did have endophyte infected tall fescue, and I dare say there's probably a good number of you that if you go back long time ago and it was seeded to this, it kind of was a wonder grass that the dairy industry quickly shunned because it was not giving good milk production, so they got away from it. But again, they're coming back to it too in situations because plant breeders made an improved variety. But the old fescue, the concerns, poor conception, extended gestation. You know, when I was learning about this, I thought, well, it's probably some scrawny little foal that got born. No, that's not the case. It extends gestation by lots and lots of days to the point that the foal continues to grow inside the mare, and thus she has birthing difficulties. And not only that, the poor gal, she has poor milk production, so she can't feed her foal. The foal has poor gain, and then you'll find that there's going to be a slight fever, kind of like the fact that if I had a fever tonight that was, 100 degrees, I'm not deathly ill, but I just feel kind of blah, okay? And so, again, that's a situation where the horse just does not feel well on this old type of tall fescue. Now, how do you determine if it's new or an old variety? There are laboratories that you can sample this tissue. You can send it to the laboratory, and they will test for the amount of alkaloid that is produced. So I would say before you think about, purchase of a property that has fescue on it, maybe the variety could have been planted after the 1990s. There's a chance that it could be an okay grass. And the way that we can do that is by, again, sampling it and sending it to a laboratory that can test for the presence of these alkaloids. Okay, next species. Anybody know what that is? Let's do a chat on this one. And I will tell you, for those of you that know what a stolon is, and we'll see one later, but there are no stolons on this plant. No stolon, no creeping stem. That's what a stolon is a creeping stem. Any chats, Miranda?
Yes, we got clover, red clover, white clover.
Okay. Well, I'm glad to know that some of you know there's more than clover. Okay.
There's clover.
There's a wise guy. Okay. That's what it is Alsike clover. Okay. This is Alsike clover. And there were some problems with Alsike clover in horses, and I'll show you a picture. And now people in the know will not sell horse owners a forage mixture that has Alsike clover in it. And this is why. Scald, sunburn, liver degeneration of all color horses. So this is essentially a very, very severe situation that this white skinned horse had severe photosensitivity. It's a photosensitive, light sensitive, high radiation type of day, presence of the right kind of plants that have the compound that's enhanced with high bright sunshine. But for animals that are dark skinned, all of them, white skin, light skin, two color skin, whatever, are going to have liver severe problems. So we want to avoid Alsike in our horse pastures. So this is Alsike clover. Okay, let's do this one. Anybody know what this one is? It's a pretty clover, right? Any guesses, Miranda? Or
we got red clover.
Good. Okay, that is red clover. We got some pubescence on it. So you look for pubescence. You note over here that the Alsike clover does not have any fuzz. Pubescence is fuzz. So this is red clover. Okay. Very good. Now, this problem may or may not happen. It's related to the type of weather conditions that we have and how long the dew or the moisture stays on the plant. Anybody know what, somebody must be laying on their back to take this picture, and they're probably getting dripped on, but what type of problem do we have there? Let's chat on that.
Yep, we got it. Slobber. Yep.
Got some slobbers, okay? And the red clover can have a compound in it called slaframine that can cause this problem. And it can happen in white clover as well. But one of the things I will tell you about hay, if you make red clover hay, if you keep it in storage for a year or more, it doesn't magically lose quality. So if you keep it in a hay barn, slaframine can go down in quantity over time. And so that would be a possible situation if you have some red clovers. Just let it stay in the barn for a year or a little bit more, and you should have lesser problems potential with slobbers in your horse. So let's talk about other forages. Anybody recognize this one? And I'm talking about the one here, this blue-green one.
Johnson grass.
Nope, that's that my great-great-grandfather's name is scourged because of Johnson grass. That's a prohibited noxious weed that was brought in as a forage, but it kind of decided to take a walk. And so that's not Johnson grass. This is a cool season grass. It's a bunch grass.
We got guesses of bluegrass or onion grass.
Nope. How about orchard grass?
Yep.
Okay. Now, I want to tell you that this is a grass that you cannot overgraze or it will say goodbye. The storage organ is about 3 or 4 inches above the soil surface. And if that gets grazed down to a nub like a putting green or even in a hayfield, if you cut too low, you're going to lose this grass. And it's a very, very good pasture grass. So again, a reason not to be grubbing it to the soil. Anybody know what that inflorescence is? That seed head. Looks like a kind of a Charlie Brown Christmas tree.
Someone said now bluegrass.
Now bluegrass. Okay.
Yes.
I didn't know about now bluegrass, but it is Kentucky bluegrass. Okay, very good. Yes, that is.
They guessed bluegrass for orchard grass, so they're saying it's bluegrass now.
It's bluegrass now. It is. Okay. Yep. So this is a panicle inflorescence of Kentucky bluegrass. What I'm going to tell you about Kentucky bluegrass, and let's go on to the next forage because they kind of go hand in hand. Anybody know what this plant is? It's a legume. This is the stolon. It creeps along the soil surface and creates new leaves, or it can create also the reproductive seed head, the bloom, the white bloom. Did that give it away? Guess what? Look here, it's a 3-leaf clover, right? Okay.
You have a guess of dandelion, but it's not that.
Well, doesn't look like it. Well, okay. Hey, you know what? Somebody has good eyes, and it's one of those puzzle things. They are right. If you look right here, can you see my cursor?
Yep.
That's dandelion. I hadn't seen that before. I looked too much at the other plant. Here's a tip of dandelion. Good for them. So that's white clover. Okay. Now, why do I talk about white clover and Kentucky bluegrass kind of together? Because in many pastures, you'll see them together. That is a plant that's called an increaser that with greater pressure of grazing, you'll find that in the field. So this is an indicator. If you see a lot of white clover and Kentucky bluegrass, and that's the dominant forage, you're grazing too hard. And you need to back off, maybe think about incorporating higher quality, not higher quality. These are very high quality forages, but higher yielding type of forages and don't graze as tight. So let's talk about weed concerns and the guides that are available. Anybody know this prohibited noxious weed, at least in my home state of Nebraska? It is not here in Indiana, probably should be. I, as a little boy, was sent down the cow pasture and dug these things out, it seemed like, for 3 weeks straight. I'm seeing more and more of this. Any guesses? This is musk.
Thistle.
Yep, it's a thistle. It's musk, M-U-S-K, or nodding thistle. And a great publication that you can purchase, hard copy or PDF, is Purdue Weed Science, WS16, Suite 16. And we need to identify the problematic weeds. It will tell us the best control practices. And with herbicide use, it will tell us what the harvest restriction is. In other words, how many days do we have to pass after the time of application before we can let livestock on the field, and the crop rotation interval. In other words, maybe we want to overseed with some legumes, and when we control broadleaves like this, there typically is going to be several months, and it depends on the herbicide used into terms of whether it's a lengthy or less lengthy time in terms of that rotation to a different crop. Anybody know that one? Beautiful fern-like plant in the first year. The second year, it will grow probably the size of a basketball goal with white flowers. It's a biennial. It will poison your animals if they eat it. Become a big problem in the state of Indiana, I'm told by our weed scientists, since the drought year of 2012. Any guesses? Poison hemlock. Okay. What about this one? Don't put those little tomatoes on your salad or you'll meet your maker. I heard a story of a horse in north central Indiana that had passed and was brought down here to Purdue, and they opened it up and it was full of this plant. Kind of hard to believe with the thorns that are in it, but it is a poison plant that actually is related to the potato and tomato, but this one has poisonous characteristics. And the animals you love, part of the word of this weed is the animal you love, well, and why we're here tonight.
Nightshade.
Well, it's not a nightshade. It's a nettle. This is horse nettle. Horse nettle, okay? So if you see those berries late to summer and it spreads, we can have a plant that can have daughter plants, and the daughter plants can have daughter plants, and the daughter of the daughter of the daughter plants can have daughter plants, and all of a sudden you got a mess, okay? It spreads, okay, by underground tissues, creeping stalks and rhizomes and so forth. So this is one we want to get under control. This is a new publication that came out this year. It's ID 516. I would highly recommend this as a resource to have. Very well done. Talks about crop scouting. And again, very, very reasonably priced. ID 516 that can be through the Purdue Education store.
So before you move on, we had
Sure.
a question about the previous slide. So they asked no sun plants,
Sun plants.
SON.
Sorry, because he kept talking about daughter plants,
Oh,
daughter plants.
I
I'm
love,
like, aren't there any sun plants?
I love the humor.
I didn't get
no.
it either.
No, I call them daughter plants because I consider the next generation to probably be more mother-like than father-like. I hate to say that, but in plants, that's probably true. Although I guess we do need to have some pollen to get the job done, okay? I love the humor, okay. Okay, grazing system improvement is another thing I want you to think about as you think about this spring and as you make potential improvements. why consider breaking your big pasture up into paddocks, which are subunits of that pasture? Why consider rotation? Plants are more like us than I think we realize. Plants need rest. Perennial plants need rest to be vigorous, to have persistence. And when we graze them down, as you recall, the picture I showed way back 40 minutes ago of that grazed down pasture, those plants are tired. And the better plants have not persisted. The other thing is when we rotate, we can have a longer grazing season. So we might be able to get an extra 6 weeks of grazing. And that means we have less need to be purchasing as much hay if they can feed for themselves. The other thing is that in the springtime, there may be one of those paddocks. Say we have a 4-paddock situation, probably one of those paddocks could be made into hay if the paddock's big enough that, you get equipment into it. And I know that's all a variation of how many animals you have and therefore the size of the pasture, whether that's even a consideration or not. But I would also say for stables that have lots of horses that they're stabling, or for those of you that are making this your livelihood in some big way, you could have horses in separate paddocks that are grazing forages of better or less quality. In other words, you might be able to have a mare in lactation with their foal on a pasture that's really high quality. Don't graze it down all the way or even leave half of the growth, and follow that up with mares that do not have foal at side and are not lactating or strictly in a maintenance mode. And we can do that type of potential leader follower type of grazing system. And I also think then when we have a rotation system, I think it results probably in more observations of what's growing in that forage. And that's a challenge I give to you. Your animals, the horses you have are beautiful. I mean, they are a classy animal. But while you're out there looking at that wonderful, nice looking animal, take the time to look at the plants, the forages, the pasture plants, and see what's happening. Are you overgrazing? Are you starting to see disease? Are there some insects that are having problems with that forage? So be a good crop scout as you look out for the well-being of your horse. So I leave you with this picture. We started out with overgrazing, right? You saw the mid-April, you saw the August scene with the crumpled can, you saw the horse feces. This is a picture of which I think we need to think about in terms of there's probably a couple more days of grazing here, but then it's time to move on for the well-being of that pasture. It needs rest. This particular field has got great opportunity if we don't graze it down to that 2-inch or less or 4-inch or less. Ideally 4-inch or less we want to avoid for the well-being of your pasture. So I want to acknowledge tonight Dr. Brady and Miranda. Thank you very much for allowing me to be a component of this. And I want to thank all the viewers that came in tonight, your participation, and give credit to a lot of these photos came from Creative Commons, and appreciate the fact that resource is out there to add some visuals to a presentation. Lastly, from a standpoint, for those of you that particularly are close to Indianapolis, the Indiana Forage Council is having an annual meeting on February 24. I think it's going to be neat opportunity. We're going to hold the meeting at SureTech Laboratories, as you can see the address here, okay? And we're going to get behind the scenes as part of our meeting and our seminar to look at the laboratory in terms of what it does for soil testing, what it does for forage testing and feed analysis. So a great opportunity for people that have that kind of interest, because be a great tour, and then we'll have a couple of speakers that are going to talk about forages, and we'll have an award ceremony and a nice supper. So that's an opportunity. Pre-registration is to be done by this coming Monday. Okay. So let's have more conversation. Or do you have questions?
Because yes,
one in
there's
the-
been.
Okay,
Oh,
got
go
it.
ahead, Dr.
Okay.
Reedy. Sorry.
You go ahead, because I'm looking for infographic on rotational grazing for Don's question.
Okay.
Okay, yeah. So we'll scroll all the way to the beginning and just go through the questions. So first concern is nurturing the best soil for future grazing.
Okay.
Any comments on that?
Well, how we nurture it is to sample it. Okay. We look at the nutrients that are there, and the past is going to determine what nutrients are there in terms of whether it's been under fertilized, over fertilized, how much manure has been hauled out to the pasture. Certainly there's nutrients there that we can have. So that's going to be quite a variable. That's one thing I think you need to do is, as soil conditions allow, purchase or borrow a soil probe, get that done, find about the nutrition of the soil, get it to somebody that has training in soil fertility and forages so you can get the right recommendations. We don't need any of those triple 12s or triple 19s. There'll be a blend that can be applied to your field and allow that then to work into the soil, okay, with rainfall. And hopefully you'll find that your pastures will respond to that. Timing wise, really in terms of giving a good growth early in the spring, a portion of those paddocks or pastures should receive some nitrogen fertilizer. Okay. Phosphorus can be applied at any time. Potassium we do not want to apply in the spring because we can have what's called luxury consumption. Potassium can end up with a lot in the tissue, more than what's necessary. Because the soils are wet, the potassium comes up with mass flow through the roots into the plant. So a time to be doing that would be, say, after June 1st, and really an ideal time for potassium would be in that late August, September timeframe, because potassium at the cellular levels like an antifreeze, okay, in terms of protection against cold weather.
Something else was mentioned was plant inventory and control, which you covered in your presentation. And then reducing weeds and moss.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not going to be able to address the moss thing. To me, that's an indication that you have probably a fair amount of shade. Okay. Would be my thought. In part, I think you got to look at the value of, if this is true, if there are trees in the shade, the value of the shade versus the concern of the moss in the soil. Okay. And shade is certainly important when we get those string of days in the summertime that, it's 95 degrees and high humidity. Certainly those are extremely problematic. But I would say, think about the situation as to whether there is a lot of shade, whether you need all that shade, realizing that shade does have value. So I'm not suggesting you necessarily remove the trees, but, and it could be a nutrient imbalance. I think take a soil test and see if there's a possibility that some nutrients are in excess or not enough of something. The other thing I'll just say as an aside, we are seeing more sulfur deficiencies in forages, just like in corn, soybeans, and wheat. So I would encourage you to look at the soil sulfur level and then maybe follow that with tissue analyses, which is better for sulfur to determine whether it's a deficiency or not. But we are seeing less sulfur because environmentally, thankfully, we've done a better job of scrubbing the after effects of electricity generation from coal, and we have less fallout, if you will, from less scrubbing of the dirty particles from coal being used in electricity generation.
So I'm trying to pick stuff that you didn't cover. What advice do you have about turning around the pasture from being overgrazed from a previous owner.
Okay. So I think you just see what happens when you don't graze it so hard. I think you just need to let the pasture grow, inventory what's there. I'm not necessarily going to suggest that you ought to change around from a bluegrass pasture. You know, bluegrass can be fairly productive as a forage, and there are some soils that it's extremely adapted to. The downside of bluegrass, I will also say, and white clover, is the fact that they're not very drought tolerant. And so we can get into a dry situation. Just think about a Kentucky bluegrass lawn that isn't irrigated in a dry July, August timeframe. And forage grass, tall fescue, those grasses are going to grow a longer period of time in a dry situation as compared to Kentucky bluegrass. But you know, previous owner, if I were to take over, I'd do a fertility check on the soil. I would change the protocol and graze down to 4 inches and, you know, take them off of the pasture and let the forage grow. And the other thing one can do, and you see this, is to feed hay to reduce the amount of pasture grazing that they will do. I will tell you, though, I think you can put a hay bale out in the pasture, and I think horses were born to graze. They weren't born necessarily to eat hay. Their preference is to graze, and they will, with the mouth structure they have, they will graze something that you think they couldn't graze. And but certainly you can feed them hay in situations in a sacrifice lot that is a winter lot maybe, or a dry lot. In the stable or something like that, to maybe try to reduce the pasture consumption, but they love to graze.
Is there a best grass to plant for easy keepers who need to graze but not necessarily take in rich grass?
You know, I probably, in terms of, and it depends on where this individual lives, but if we're in the Midwest environment, you know, I really look to these improved tall fescues as being a great resource. They can take a bit more abuse in dry weather. They're not as prone to disease problems. Insects tend to be warded off by the plant. They have the nutrition need, as it was described, for maintenance, easy keepers. I still probably would try to put an adapted legume in it, maybe a little bit of white clover. And I know sometimes that plant can cause slobbers, but from the standpoint of reducing nitrogen fertilization, get a legume in that stand. Red clover is probably a little more fickle from the standpoint of being a problem with slobbers, so maybe think about avoiding that in the pasture setting. For those that truly will be trained to even do a bit of undergrazing and have the luxury to do that, bird's foot trefoil would be a possibility too as a legume. I don't know if I consider it necessarily to be an easy keeper if you graze hard, but if you do the 4-inch, 6-inch rule, graze and move them on, that plant will persist as well. But an improved tall fescue is probably where I'd start. That doesn't have the alkaloid production problem to cause all the nasty things we talked about. And somebody that's in the forage industry will know that, okay? And if they've never heard of novel endophyte tall fescue, you're not in the right store. And the right store is probably not the big box stores, okay? You need to go to somebody that's trained in forages and knows their varieties well. And you can have that conversation, and you know, and if they kind of say, well, I don't know, probably move on and find your seed elsewhere.
Safe way to get rid of burdocks.
Safe way? Well, be like an 8-year-old boy and that was handed a shovel. That's a pretty safe way. I don't know the particular chemistry of herbicides, but certainly there are herbicides and that will take burdock out. That booklet that I talked about, WS16, gives a rating for weeds. It's a rating from up to 9, and 9s are what you want for control. I probably would not select a herbicide that's been rated anything less than an 8 to really have good control. So the weed scientists have done a good job of providing us ratings. So I look for a rating that's an 8 or 9 on the Burdock in that publication. Then I would read the bullet points that are within it in terms of the restrictions associated with grazing. And then the next step is you read the label. And don't be tired when you read a label, okay? Because it's a little heavy. But in terms of what you apply, when you apply, how much to apply, the restrictions, crop rotation interval, all of that will be in that label, and they'll be on the internet that you can find them.
Advice on poor drainage areas.
Advice on poor drainage areas. Consider tiling if that makes any sense at all, for that excess water to be removed by tiling. If it doesn't make sense from an economic standpoint, or moving the water off of the property, then I would consider different forages that are able to grow in a wetter soil environment. The one that is no longer able to be sold in the state of Indiana, I almost showed the picture of this, but I don't think I see it in horse pastures very often, but reed canary grass will do very poorly drained situations. But again, seed cannot be purchased because it's considered to be an invasive species. It can move fairly readily, unfortunately, and there were improved varieties that make it an option. But again, I probably would look at these improved tall fescues are pretty versatile. As long as the water isn't there for more than a day or two. Now, a situation where it's saturated for a month, pretty tough to have grasses that will fit that type of situation. Other than reed canary grass, and again, you aren't going to be able to get the seed because of issues of it being potentially invasive.
So when we think about metabolic horses like that have metabolic issues, is there like a safer time to start grazing or graze?
That's an interesting concept and question that I struggle with. And I'm not really in tune like the veterinarians will be that understand metabolic disorders. I'm not going to claim to know really much of anything about it. But this is the bit of irritant with me about this is, if you are feeding concentrates, if you're feeding those pellets, if you're feeding energy in that type of form, I think first of all, see if you can reduce that type of feed resource and don't worry as much about the pasture, because you've got fiber in that pasture, okay? Now, if you're talking about, say, an easy keeper that gets quite well on forage alone and doesn't have those the concentrates, the pellets, the sweet feeds and all of that, probably just don't be grazing as when it's super vegetative. When it's super vegetative, it's going to have a higher load of non-structural carbohydrates, the simple sugars, as compared to when it gets to knee high. When you start getting it to waist high, there's going to be a lot of fiber in it, and they're going to be very selective in what they graze, and there'll be a lot of trampling of the forage and waste from that particular standpoint. But as a plant ages, it's going to have lesser amount of those simple sugars that can cause some of these, I understand, metabolic disorders as compared to an older growing grass, but there's going to be some compromise there as well. And I'll defer to trained veterinarians, and maybe some of you are out there tonight that are those veterinarians that feel free to make comment. But again, the first thing I would do, if you're feeding those high energy feeds, reduce the amount fed of them to help.
You know, what I think what I'd like to add, and Dr. Johnson's 100% spot on. The big thing you want to do is reduce those sugars. And the first place to look is in your sweet feed, mixed feed, whatever your concentrate is. The forages are vitally important for the horse in order, not just from a nutritional perspective, but also to keep their digestive tract functioning correctly. So you want to be really careful about limiting forages. And that actually gets back to Dr. Johnson's comment about horses are, I mean, they're born to graze on pasture. Yes, if we give them hay, they'll eat hay if they don't have another option. But, you know, I know I'm fortunate enough, my horse is at a place where he's turned out 12 hours a day. They'll go dig through the snow to get to whatever's left of the grass rather than stand at the round bale that they have access to. But when you look at rotational grazing, you can do it in a couple different ways too. If you have animals that you need to have on a lower non-structural carbohydrate diet, then you do your rotational grazing, that you move those horses onto more mature pasture instead of onto less mature pasture. So as you think about what you need for the horses you have, you can think about how rotational grazing can help you do that. Instead of having them on that young pasture that is so lush and tasty and really high in those NSCs, or potentially put those horses on a pasture that's a little older, a little more mature. And then as the next pasture or the next piece grows and gets more mature, then you can move those horses to that. And as they graze it down to a level, then move them along. Because once it gets tall enough, they won't graze on it either. They'll just ignore it. Like he said, trample it and make a mess. So, but be really cautious about restricting forages excessively, trying to control that, because you can create a whole lot of other issues. And I'm not a nutritionist, and I did not stay at a Holiday Inn Express last night, but to connect you with some of the best forage nutritionists, horse forage nutritionists in the country, and that are doing a lot of work in this area. And we can connect you through our National Extension Horses group with some of the courses and stuff about specifically about working with metabolic disease in horses.
So I know I skipped around a lot, but if there's any, as we wrap up, are there any last minute questions? If so, go ahead and put those in the chat.
You know, I know we've lost a lot of people in the last 20 minutes, but what I would like to know, that those of you who are still online, is what was the question I posed, Miranda, specifically?
Yeah.
Can you say that?
So after listening to all this information, what is the first thing that you plan to do to improve your pasture management?
First thing. Yep.
Yeah, just one.
Just one.
We got cut down a few trees. Getting the geotextile for a in the sacrifice area. Take inventory. Arrange to have soil samples taken.
I'd be willing to come out and help that person learn how to do it.
The soil samples or the geotextile or the cutting down trees?
All the above.
You don't want me with a chainsaw, I'll tell you that. No way. And I grew up in the plains, and I'll tell you what, one thing I do really appreciate about this part of the country are the trees.
All right. Well, do you want to put your contact information up there, Dr.
Yep.
Johnson?
Yep.
And we'll just stay on. And if there's any last minute questions, we'll address those. But thank you so much for joining our very first session. We have 2 more sessions coming up, so those will be posted on Facebook. So be sure to follow Purdue Horse Extension, and the recording will be posted on Extension Horses Facebook page. So thank you so much.
Now, feel free to reach out to me if you have forage related questions. That certainly is a big part of my job. And thank you for being a part of this evening. And thank you, Dr. Brady and Miranda, for the opportunity.
No, thank you. You were the star.
And again, those of you that are there, I'm willing to, after we stop recording, I can hang around and answer one-on-one questions if you'd like.